let's get into today's session. So I'm going to hand over quite swiftly to Tom about role-based access. Some of you may have seen this content before, or some of it when we did the event in GMP. But Tom, let's take it over to you, and let's start with defining what role-based access is.
Yeah, good afternoon. So role-based access is ultimately using a user's role to determine what access they have access to within your organization. There's part of this presentation, what we'll be doing is looking at a number of aspects that this is built upon. So the NEP introduced SailPoint, delivered a minimal viable product as part of that delivery. So this is really looking at how we can extend that MVP to gain even more value from the capability. Looking specifically at the movers, because I think this is really where the value is of using role-based access. Key point is those responsibilities, the ownership, the sponsorship, making sure that this is looked at from an organizational perspective, and really what those challenges are. And this is not a small sort of time-bound piece of work. This is quite a significant change to how you approach identity management within your organization. And then finally, looking at the next steps, what you can do within your own force to take this forward. So, in terms of the current MVP position, there was three elements of that, which was the joiners, movers and levers. Joiners and levers, I think forces were already pretty good at in terms of managing the provision of new identities, getting system access, and of course those users leaving. But that was often quite a manual process, lots of emails flying around, timings maybe weren't necessarily spot on, and as a result, accounts might not be available for the time that the user starts work, or ultimately left active once they leave. The real part of the MVP that really wasn't looked at in real detail and exploited was the movers, because this is not something that can be looked at within a sort of relatively small piece of work. But what we did do as part of that NEP delivery was look at the movers process, how you can use SailPoint and deliver three role sort of automations as part of this, really to demonstrate how SailPoint could work and kind of give you that impetus to start looking at it into the and at the next level. I think it's probably fair to say that a lot of forces maybe haven't taken SailPoint and really leveraged those capabilities. And I think it's probably down to a couple of things. Priorities are always challenging in terms of projects and resources. Often maybe a little bit of lack of understanding of really how this technology can be leveraged, but also maybe the opportunities that it gives at a more strategic level haven't been realized. So if we look beyond the MVP, I think this is really the focus of this session. What we want to be able to do is look to how you can use SailPoint. So let's start just by giving a little bit of an introduction to SailPoint and the basics that it has available. Just move on to the next slide. It's sticking for me. Thank you. So from an identity perspective, the key part of SailPoint is obviously the identity. This is the person, but it's defined within SailPoint as an identity, their name and the email, something that is unique to that particular individual. Next within that is the identity cube, and sorry, I couldn't find a picture of a cube that was any good, but ultimately the identity cube is the aspect within SailPoint that includes all of the elements of the user, the systems they have access to, the roles, additional attributes that would be coming through from maybe HR, maybe Active Directory, but builds up a complete picture of that particular user at that point in time. And I think that is key of understanding the identity cube and how that then links in with the overall identity piece. So really, what is role-based? In essence, it's taking attributes or triggers from a system and using those that determine access through to underlying systems. So in this example, we've got a project manager. So traditionally, you might have had a request come into the IT team to say, we've got a new project manager. They could have moved internally and you'd have to do some manual steps. They would need project, Microsoft project installed on their device, and they would need access to some additional resources, so Project Online maybe. Now, the deployment of that application may be automated. You may have to put them into a group, and that allows that to happen, or maybe you actually remote into their computer and manually install that software. But ultimately, what SailPoint does is it takes some attributes from the HR system, being that definitive source, in this case, the role being project manager, and based on the rules within SailPoint, you can automatically put it into the group to deploy Microsoft Project and access to Project Online. That way, you don't have any manual steps, and as soon as those attributes are live within the HR system, that then flows down to SailPoint, and ultimately the user is working and able to get access to the resources they need quickly and effectively. So if we look at the components of role-based access control, first step is the user. They're at the center of this, but those users have a role defined, and that role is defined within your HR or your ERP system, because that is the key part of the trigger of this process. That role is ingested into SailPoint and part of that user's identity cube. Within that role definition within SailPoint, you determine which access groups that particular role is a member of, and that could cover everything from file shares to applications being deployed, distribution groups, shared mailboxes, etc. And then the last piece is it's where those actual resources groups are defined against the physical resources in questions. This is your file shares, these are your Microsoft Teams, etc. A big no-no around this is never take a user and directly add them to a resource. Technically possible, but you lose all visibility, because you cannot look at the user and say, what does this user have access to? The only way you can define is to look at every single resource where you could have something applied. And it's just not technically or physically possible to be able to do that across your entire organization and be confident that you have, in fact, removed that user from all of the places that they should no longer have access. So using role-based control not only improves the automation and simplifies the process and standardizes the process, it also gives you that, that confidence that you have a view of what your users have access to. Now, I think traditionally, the approach to movers has been very manual. It's been centered around the IT department. They would be the ones that are getting the requests, maybe from HR, maybe from the individuals that own these resources, maybe from a line manager. They can come and from a variety of different places. And they would then be adding them to those resource groups and potentially other systems that are outside of Active Directory as well. Getting users into it, because people make a lot of noise when they can't do their job. So I think, again, pretty good at getting those permissions added, but often those roles aren't removed, and users will just gather access to systems as they move roles within the organization without necessarily an appropriate use for them remaining. And that just gives us a whole heap of problems. Not only is there issues around users accessing systems they no longer need, you've got organizational risk, increased risk of data leakage. There's also licensing risks. If you've got project managers, for example, that are allocated Microsoft Project and they no longer become project managers, if they're not removed from that group, you're still providing licenses for them that they don't need. So it can be significant cost as well. Within that too, you've got the you've got the elements of the manual access, and I think that is a key part here, where the manual access reviews being carried out is just incredibly time consuming. How do you look at your resources that you own, and effectively confirm that each individual is still right to have access. So often it doesn't happen, it can be inaccurate, and ultimately you're never going to be in a position where you can be 100% comfortable that access to your resources is true and appropriate. And it's also really difficult to audit. If somebody is just being added into a resource group, for example, trying to find the source of that change, who did it, on what authority, etc. So again, from an auditing perspective, very, very difficult. So as we sort of said earlier, we've got the approach of RBAC having HR at its core. And I think as far as the implementation that was delivered as part of NEP, the definitive authoritative source was defined as HR. And I think this is probably the same across all organisations. HR is no longer a HR system, it is an enterprise system, hence many forces taking ERP systems, but maybe not necessarily using them to their full effect, and understanding that the data held within them is in fact organisational data, is being used across the entire estate. So having that HR data up to date is absolutely critical. The next step of this is, of course, the approach of how do you actually begin to introduce RBAC. I would say start big, and what I mean by that is look at those broad areas that a lot of users have access to, where you can define the individual groups, roles, etc. that you could use. So it may be all police officers or all members of the ICT department or HR department would have specific systems, and the information that you currently hold within HR is sufficient to be able to create those rules. And I think that's probably a really good way of being able to demonstrate the opportunities here, and then over time become more and more granular. It's also about, really improving the awareness of this and understanding exactly what the reliance of the HR data is. You may have a number of users within your organization that have similar role names, but in fact they do very, very different roles. So is there an element of standardizing on that role, so everybody that has that role name does in fact have the same system access? Or do you break those roles out, make them individual, and then set specific roles against each? So there's an assessment level that needs to be carried out against that too. And the last piece is looking at the possibility of extending SailPoint beyond Active Directory. What we've got within Identity Now is very much focused at the Active Directory, again offered as part of the NEP, was how do we take the integration of Office 365 as your Active Directory and give us that capability. But this gives us the opportunity to access any system, whether it be an on-premise system controlled via Active Directory, but you can also extend SailPoint to go beyond that. And that gives you the ability of integrating this with systems that are just not Active Directory aware. So that may be your command and control system, your crime system, a legacy system, those ones where you have to enter a separate username and password. Difficulty with that is that you've got separate username and passwords, and obviously they start to get written down in the back of daybooks. It also, again, with that separation, the overarching management of this is difficult. But by using SailPoint to integrate with those systems, you can bring this in to be part of that user's identity cube. So that will give you the opportunity to onboard those users, give them usernames and passwords that are the same as their Active Directory, so they don't get prompt, and it just simplifies the processes. Now, getting into the responsibilities of where this lies within the force. This is a top-down, and I really cannot stress this enough. This isn't an isolated IT project or HR project or a particular system owner's project. This is something that is organizational and has to be driven from the top. So if you can get into your chief officer team, chief officer group, SRT, whatever they're called locally within your force, in getting that sponsorship so they understand what this is actually going to achieve and what it can deliver is absolutely key. There are a number of governance functions which are a part of this. Now, within those, we need to be driving that adoption. We need to be able to report on that adoption. We need to be looking at the HR data, the roles and the commonality of those, and actually how do we bring in new systems as well? What is the process that if, whether it's something as simple as a new team site that you need to control the access to, or whether it be a large cross-force system, having that onboarding and how you define the roles and how you define the access is key. Now, as I've said, and I'll probably say it a few more times through this, the accuracy of that HR data is absolutely key, but it's also how up to date the processes are that drives that data. There's no point having 100% accurate data in terms of people's job roles if it actually doesn't get updated in HR 2 weeks after they start. So again, it's making sure that those business processes are timely. Mentioned about the standardization of job titles. And again, this is something that can be looked at now, starting to do a bit of an assessment of your own HR data. ICT, again, they're going to be part of this because they're going to be the ones that are actually looking at the underlying resources and how that information is presented back, and how you would then define the mapping between roles and those underlying resources. So IT being is a key part of this. And then finally, your data system owners. They're the ones that ultimately own the data to these systems and have the final say on who should be getting access. So involving those, allowing them to be included in the conversation to determine who they think are appropriate to have access. And again, looking at this in a more holistic way. So back to my point earlier, where you had two people in the same department with the same role, actually in their day-to-day, they do quite different jobs. But the question is, would it be simpler if those users had access to all of the systems that they both use? So a single role gaining access to single systems. They might not use them on a day-to-day basis, but is it appropriate? And does it actually make the underlying role-based access model slightly simpler? And then around this, of course, is the users. They're the ones that have got the expectations. They know what they need to get out of this. They want to be able to do their jobs quickly and efficiently. So that has to be the driver here. If your users aren't getting actually what they need and they're still having to phone the service desk to try and chase things up, then your role-based access system isn't working effectively. Now, challenges, there are many. HR data, again, key. Awareness and responsibilities, we need to understand and start to map this out. And this isn't only about actually the onboarding and the adoption of role-based, it's how does this move forward? So the access reviews, making sure that there is an appropriate review of these roles and the systems that they have access to, and making sure that there's a process in place that if people move roles that are responsible for systems, that there is an appropriate transfer of that ownership. You can take those systems that are non-AD, and again, this will be a local decision. There could be a number of systems that you have, but you have a timeline for the replacement of them. So therefore, the integration with that single Active Directory identity is coming. So the effort of actually onboarding them to SailPoint might not be beneficial, but that is certainly something that you could leverage an element of SailPoint. So for example, let me just say, your crime system, for example, you have a separate username and password, you have a separate security model, it's all done by somebody else. But what you could do within this is just, if there's a role that would get access to that system, send the system owner an email, and you could trigger that from SailPoint. Again, they will get informed that somebody needs to be added, or ultimately that somebody needs to be removed. So there's some sort of middle point that you can get to there. This isn't local. This is not a force-centric aspect. A lot of the benefits are going to be local to the force, a lot of the definitions and the systems, but this can also be extended around regional and national systems. For example, you may have a group, and this is something that's coming as part of Office 365, that maybe your ROCU is working across a free force collaboration. There's one force that is hosting access to a team site with some channels and data, etc. There's a new function that would allow you to put people into a group within your own Office 365 tenant, but the force that is hosting that ROCU resource could read those members and automatically add them into that ROCU group that they host. So again, having that standardization would help within that, but also we've got the national systems coming, NLEDS being the first, and there's a lot of work that I know the NLEDS team are doing with forces around raising awareness and the reliance and the need for RBAC as part of that onboarding. Temporary roles is a big question. You can only have one role defined within HR. But within SailPoint, what you can do is that you can manually add people to roles. That might be someone from HR goes in and goes, this person is also a special. This gives them access to all of these particular resources, or it may be a system owner as well that has the ability of adding people, or people could request, you know, I'm temporarily filling in for somebody this week, can I be part of this role? And you can time limit those. So there's a number of groups that you can do it, but within SailPoint, there is an issue with people having two roles defined against them as part of that identity cube, but it may not necessarily be as simple to automate that coming from your HR, depending on what it is. And that also covers the dual roles. You know, that may be a temporary piece, but it also may be an ongoing. And again, by doing that gives you that flexibility. Now, looking at the sort of the next steps, what we've got is a big piece of work ahead. I don't think anybody is denying, but it's not something that you have to achieve in one hit. Engaging with your leadership team, making them aware of the opportunities, getting that sponsorship, having those conversations between your HR and ICT teams. And if you have got a single SLT member who's responsible for both, then you're probably in a much better position because they're able to actually bring those two departments together and help have those conversations and try and apply some influence towards the HR for them to be able to drive the improvements if they're needed around that HR data. I think the reality is that HR might not have a huge amount to gain from a standardized set of data, but ultimately it is going to give that organizational benefit. The business processes around this are also absolutely key, making sure that those are efficient and effective, and then managing those role changes and those movers changes is going to be a key piece. So looking at those and understanding those is definitely something that would add benefit. And use that low-hanging fruit. The opportunity to look at a police officer, for example, or a member of a particular department or team, if you're able to understand and define the membership and use that to bring together all of the resources that they use, that could again, give you a real good opportunity to demonstrate that to the senior leadership team and get that buy-in. And finally, national IM, absolutely. This is something that is coming. As I said, NLEDS is the first. There are many more to come, and there is a reliance there on SailPoint and making sure that there's appropriate data being fed from the HR system in a timely manner. So again, beware, engage with that NLEDS team. They've done a number of workshops. I know there was one, I think, last week. So there's a lot of work that they're doing as well, specifically around the requirements from a national IM perspective. So I appreciate there was an awful lot of context there. It was quite fast. There was a lot to get through within the sort of the 20-25 minutes we had. I've seen that there's a few questions coming through, so if I can, happy to answer them now.
Yeah, let's go for them. And there's some really valuable questions, some real detail. And of course, this isn't your only opportunity. The business engagement team will be able to help as well. But first question is, where device name is required for software installation, the IDN will not do this. We still have to have a manual step. But you know, it's going on about when we're actually manually putting products onto computers, isn't it, here as well? So you did cover it a little bit, but can you go into a little bit more detail on this?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. There is some aspects there, but it's also dependent on the type of software that you're using to do this. So, for example, with Intune, which again is part of the Office 365 suite, it's very user-centric. So you would put the user into a group, and depending on the computer that they use, that would be available to them, but not necessarily somebody else that uses that computer. Appreciate it. It may not fit in every instance, but it is still a benefit that can be leveraged if you're in an opportunity to.
Okay. Another question here might be a little bit similar. If a user is assigned a role from the IDN portal, is there a way of removing this role when the user moves within the organization without reverting to the basic information? I think is what you were saying, but you can assign new roles.
Yeah, so you would assign a second role, but yeah, if they moved, then yeah, there would be a manual step. But again, this is where you would have an element of those review policies. So 6 monthly, you would, as a system owner, you could be looking at those and going, this user no longer should have access. So yeah, I think there isn't necessarily a completely perfect way to this, but it's also worth mentioning that the identity cube and the allocation of those identities to, or those roles to resources, isn't necessarily directed just by the user's role. There could be other attributes that are used. It may be location, it could be a combination of location and role and manager that determine through the logic what resource and which role they're a member of. So there could be some other elements and other attributes within HR that you could use to drive those second roles. But again, it would be dependent on your HR system.
A question I picked up on was, obviously you spoke about sometimes the data owner can be the decision maker, and SailPoint supports this. That takes a little bit of the burden away from the HR and the IT team. How well automated could this be? Is it a simple matter, or can we develop business processes for this?
Yeah, definitely. So I think it's also probably fair to say that you would never ever, and I'll say that with a slight pinch of hesitancy, get to a point where you have every single role mapped to every single resource. It's going to be a point where the amount of effort to get to that is just not worth it. So having areas where you would request access from a user, I need to get this. That can be time bound. So the person who approves it says, yeah, I'm happy for that. They can have it for the next 2 months. You could also have it so a business owner approves those requests. So it doesn't all have to be fully automated from a role perspective driven by the HR data. You can also take some of those decisions and some of those business processes and push them towards the system owners and away from IT, where not necessarily IT have the authority or the information to be able to make an informed decision.
And does that link to things like training courses? So when somebody's been on a training, how do we update so that they can get access to different platforms that they now train to use?
Yeah, now this is probably where things such as the MVP does need to be extended. If you've got that training information as attributes within your HR system and that's being fed into Identity Now, that may well be possible to use that as a logic step as part of any provisioning. But the reality is that your training system may be slightly separate. Now, Identity Now has the opportunity to have a number of feeds that bring the information into SailPoint and encapsulate it within that identity cube. That could be a separate training database. If you've got a way of identifying the user and mapping them through to the user with Identity Now, you could use that as part of that logic. Identity Now has what they call I'm just trying to remember the terminology now. I think it was license packs or access packs. 5 were included as part of the MVP. 3 were used as part of the delivery of NEP. 1 is secured for the national IM. So, you may already have an available license that you could use within Force to talk to your training system or another system that is outside Active Directory. So yeah, discuss that with your IT team.
Thanks, Tom. And I'm conscious of time and we have gone past the hour, but just a couple of questions. It's not just about system access, it's also about access to information, and having good identity access management will help with things like Yammer groups, targeting news updates, and improving the whole communications mix of the Force as well, won't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, that role and that allocation could be file shares, shared mailboxes, distribution groups, those types of things.
So it can be really at the heart and fundamental of how we access information across the system, not just the platform management. Now, we are running out of time and we've got lots of questions in here that we haven't been able to get to. So we will pick them up. Where you pop your name, we'll pass them on to the business engagement manager and try and get some responses to you. But if you have got other questions and you want to know more, please get in touch with your business engagement manager. You can scan the QR code, go to the PDS website, fill in the form and pick that up. We've put their details up on screen as well there, so you can get hold of them. But please get involved if you want to know more. This isn't the end of it. This is a way of perhaps exciting you and getting you interested in the opportunity. If you want to know more, please reach out and we'll try and give you the support we can do. So thanks very much for joining us today. We have got a really good couple of webinars coming up before the February half term. Next week we're looking at designs and blueprints and what's important about them, and then the week after, we've got Lancashire Police joining us to go through how they're using the Ideas platform and how they manage that. So hope you can join us again in a couple of weeks' time. Thanks for joining us today.